curious how you approach or recommend that we approach deload because I know that there's kind of a couple different, I know of a couple different approaches to that. So,
Mhm. So let's start with the goal of a deload. When you're doing a deload, it's essentially a recovery phase. It is meant to be easier than your normal training. Typically, with a lot of the training phases, let's call them mesocycles, you train for a while. Over time, even though you're taking rest days, you're accumulating fatigue. At some point, you cannot progress anymore. You hit a wall, or the workouts get pretty challenging. I'm going to open a bracket here. So, with the workout that you are doing, if you feel like you can keep on pushing for another week, even though technically deload is going to be in, what's this, like a week? If you feel like you can keep on pushing and you can get another good solid week of accumulation training, we can delay the deload. If you feel like I do need that deload, and sometimes if you need it sooner, that is also fine. So I wouldn't say a deload is necessarily fixed in time and
mhm. Yeah.
you cannot do it sooner or later. But at some point, you reach a level where you just need to take a break and you need to tone down and reduce the fatigue. Fatigue accumulates over time. So regardless of how many rest days you're doing, if you're training hard enough for a while, you on general are going to be building fatigue. And with every consecutive week, it's going to get higher and higher and higher. At some point, you just need to take an easier week. So sometimes it could be just easier. Could be a partial deload where you're only deloading certain exercises. Sometimes you can deload everything across the board. This is what we're doing with you. Again, the more experienced you are, you can sort of figure out when is the best time to deload and whether you need a full-blown deload. But also I use the deload as a transition to a different phase. So we're doing a certain type of training, we're running a certain type of cycle, and then after this, we're going to put you on something that's going to be slightly different. And in order for you to keep on progressing for another, I forgot what exactly I have planned for you, but to be able to progress for another few to several weeks, we need to taper off, have you rest, have you recover, so you're able to hit it hard again with a different cycle. Sometimes that transition can be pretty smooth, and due to the way the different training cycles have been designed, you may not need a deload. So let's say you start a training cycle with peak at a certain level, and then we introduce a new training cycle that is so different that in reality, the whole cycle is going to be a deload from the current stimulus. So let's say if you're doing some certain type of a very high hypertrophic workout, and then we switch it to a very strength-based focused workout that's very low volume, the fact that you're doing something very different is going to be deload. The whole cycle is going to be a deload. So you don't need a dedicated deload week. In this case, we're going to do something different. So that's why we have the deload. Now, there's different ways to approach deload. The example that you gave me there, this is awesome. But ultimately, it just means doing less. Typically, it's going to be less volume because volume tends to accumulate the most amount of fatigue. So volume is the total amount of work that you are doing, which is the some combination of all the reps, sets, and load combined. You multiply them together and you get like the total workload. It's a little bit more complicated than this because you need to take into account like just how hard you're pushing, not just numbers in a spreadsheet. Like to give you an example, a deadlift is going to accumulate way more fatigue than a bicep curl. You can do 5 sets of bicep curls, and you're not going to accumulate as much fatigue as, let's say, 2 sets or even a single set of very, very heavy deadlifts. But ultimately, we're trying to reduce the volume, which would come down to doing fewer sets, fewer reps, or less load, any combination of these. What I choose to do when I did in your case is just lower the sets, because if you lower the sets, you automatically lower the reps and the load. You're doing fewer reps and you're not using it the same. We're still using the same amount of load, but it's not multiplied by the same number of sets. So this is just one way of doing it. I wouldn't say that's right or wrong in most cases, unless you're trying to deload in a very specific way, and maybe you only deload the load, but you keep the same amount of volume. So most of the time, I would say 90% of the time, any combination that's going to result in just a easier workout is going to work. Sometimes you want to specifically reduce only the load and keep the same number of sets and reps or do something different. Sometimes a deload could be just doing a completely different exercise. Say, for example, you can replace a deadlift with a leg curl. That could be a deload.